The morning Coraline Voss laughed at the most powerful immortal in existence. She was wearing mismatched socks and had ink on her left cheek from a leaking pen. This detail matters, because people tend to imagine these moments differently. They picture the woman as poised, beautiful, perfectly lit. They imagine she understood the weight of what was happening, but Coraline understood nothing that morning, except that her rent was 3 weeks late, her bicycle had a flat tire, and the man sitting across the antique desk in the Alderton Municipal Archive was the most unsettling person she had ever encountered in her 28 years of quiet, unremarkable life. She had not asked for this appointment. It had been arranged on her behalf by her supervisor, a nervous little man named Gerald, who had called her into his office 2 days prior, with sweat on his forehead and a piece of cream-colored paper trembling in his hand. The letter had requested the services of the archive's rare document specialist. It had not asked. It had requested, in the way that mountains request that rivers move around them rather than through them. The man waiting for her was named Dorian Vale. Or, rather, that was the name written on the appointment card. Coraline had done what any reasonable person would do upon receiving a mysterious summons from a stranger. She had searched for him. She had found almost nothing, which was strange in an era when everyone existed somewhere online. There was a company. There was a name on some very old property deeds that a local history forum had argued about for years. There was a photograph taken at a charity function 11 years ago, in which a tall, pale man with dark hair stood slightly apart from the crowd, looking at something beyond the frame of the camera with an expression that made the forum users uncomfortable enough to post about it at length. He looked exactly the same in person. Not similar. Exactly the same. Same jaw. Same dark eyes. Same particular quality of stillness that made him look less like a man standing in a room and more like a very convincing painting of one. Coraline sat down across from him, pulled her notebook from her bag, clicked her pen, discovered it was the leaking one, and quickly switched it for another, and looked up to find him watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not boredom. It was not impatience. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a very specific thing for a very long time, and had become so accustomed to waiting that the anticipation itself had calcified into something quieter and harder. She introduced herself. He already knew her name. He knew her full name, her published research on medieval land registry documents, and the title of her university thesis, which had been read by approximately 40 people in the entire world. He recited this information without showing off, the way someone might confirm an address before handing over a parcel. Matter of fact. Precise. Slightly unnerving. She asked how she could help him. He placed a document on the desk between them. It was old. Genuinely, breathtakingly old. The kind of old that Coraline could feel in her fingertips before she even touched it. A particular quality of age that she had developed a sensitivity to over years of handling things that had no business surviving as long as they had. She pulled on her cotton gloves and leaned forward, and for a few minutes she forgot entirely about the strange man sitting opposite her, because the document in front of her was extraordinary. It was a property deed, written in a dialect of medieval French that had fallen out of common use before the printing press existed. The handwriting was extraordinarily consistent, almost mechanical in its precision for something produced without modern tools. The seal at the bottom was intact, which should have been impossible given the age of the parchment. And the name on the deed, the name of the original owner of the estate being transferred, was Dorian Aurelius Vale. She looked up. He was watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. She looked back down at the document, at the date, at the name, at the handwriting, which had a particular quality she could not immediately name, but recognized somewhere in the less rational part of her brain as belonging to someone who had written things by hand for a very, very long time. She looked up again. He said nothing. She said, "This is from the 13th century." He said, "Yes," she said, "this is your name." He said, "Yes." She sat back in her chair and looked at him properly for the first time, not as an unusual client, not as an interesting problem, but as a thing that did not fit inside the categories she had built for the world over 28 years of careful, methodical observation. He sat perfectly still under her scrutiny. He did not fidget or offer an explanation or fill the silence with nervous words the way most people do when they are being studied. He simply let her look, with the patience of something very old and very certain. Coraline was by nature a person who lived inside her own head. She was not dramatic. She was not impulsive. She processed information slowly and thoroughly, like water moving through limestone, and she did not speak until she had something worth saying. What she finally said was, "You should know that I'm a trained researcher. I'm going to need significantly more than one document." Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. A fraction of a degree of change in the region around his eyes. But she caught it. Because she had spent years learning to read things that did not want to be read, it looked improbably like relief. She brought him back 3 days later with a list. It was not a short list. Coraline did not produce short lists. She produced thorough ones, cross-referenced and annotated, printed on paper she had recycled from a draft of something else, because she refused to waste a fresh sheet on something provisional. The list contained 17 categories of documentation she would need to examine before she could form any responsible conclusions about the nature of what he was asking her to authenticate. Dorian Vale looked at the list for a long moment. Then, he produced all 17 categories. Simultaneously, from a leather case that she was increasingly certain was older than her grandmother's house. She stared at the documents spread across the archive table and felt the particular dizzy sensation that only came when reality was being more interesting than she had budgeted for. He watched her process this. She had noticed, by the second meeting, that he did this consistently. He watched her think. Not the way people sometimes watched her when they were impatient for an answer, glancing at their phones and tapping their fingers, and doing that specific sequence of behaviors that communicated, "Please stop thinking, and just tell me." He watched the way she imagined naturalists watched things in the wild, quiet and complete and entirely prepared to wait as long as the process required. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. This confused her. She worked through the documents in the order she had listed them, making notes, asking questions when she needed clarification, and trying to ignore the growing, unreasonable certainty assembling itself in the corner of her mind like a structure she had not given permission to build. He answered every question she asked, directly, without deflection, without the slight pause that people use when they are deciding how much truth to include in an answer. He described events with the detail of a witness rather than the vagueness of someone working from historical research. He used the present tense about people who had been dead for centuries in a way that felt like habit rather than rhetoric. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Coraline put down her pen, aligned it carefully with the edge of her notebook, and said, "I need you to say it out loud." He said, "Say what?" She said, "The thing you're not saying." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for words, but the quiet of someone deciding whether the moment had arrived. Then he said, "I was born in the winter of 1247, in a village that no longer exists under a name that no one living would recognize. I have not aged since my 31st year. I have been many things in the time between then and now, but for the last 3 centuries, I have been what your folklore calls a vampire, and what I would simply call myself." Coraline looked at him. He looked back. She picked up her pen again and said, "Okay, what's the full legal name on the original title deed, including the territorial designation?" He told her. She wrote it down. She did not scream or run or reach for something to press against her chest in a protective gesture. She asked a follow-up question, because she was a researcher, and researchers followed threads. This thread happened to have led somewhere extraordinary, but the methodology did not change, simply because the subject matter had stopped being ordinary. By the end of the afternoon, she had filled 9 pages of notes and developed a working theory that the documents were authentic, that the man sitting across from her was exactly what he claimed to be, and that she was going to need a significantly larger notebook. What she did not develop, not that afternoon, was any particular fear of him. This seemed to surprise him. Not dramatically. He did not say anything about it directly. But there was a quality to his attention that shifted somewhere around the 6th hour, a very slight recalibration, as though she was continuing to fail to behave in a way he had predicted, and he was quietly revising his model. She found this interesting. He asked at the end of the session whether she would return the following week. She said she would need to return considerably more often than that if they were going to do this properly. He said that was acceptable. She pulled on her coat, gathered her notes, and was almost at the door when she turned back. Not for any particular reason, just one of those small, impulsive movements the body sometimes makes before the brain has finished deliberating. He was still watching her. She said, "For what it's worth, you give very good primary source testimony." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You are the first person in a very long time who has asked me questions without wanting something from the answers." She considered this. She said, "I want accuracy." That's something. She left before she could see his expression change, which was a shame, because it would have told her something important. Not yet, but eventually, she would understand that the thing she had seen in that first fractional shift of his face, the thing that looked like relief, had been only the beginning of something much larger and much older beginning, at last, to move. By the 4th week, Coraline had developed a routine. She arrived at the archive at 8:15, which was 45 minutes before it officially opened, because Gerald had given her a key, and the unspoken understanding that whatever was happening with the Vale account was important enough to warrant unusual accommodations. She made tea in the small back kitchen. She carried it to the main document room, and she arranged her materials in the specific order that allowed her brain to shift from the general noise of being a person in the world to the focused quiet of being a researcher with a problem. Dorian arrived at 9. Always, exactly at 9, with the punctuality of someone for whom time had stopped being approximate a very long while ago. They worked. They talked, in the way that people talk when the talking is mostly in service of the work. Question and answer, and clarification, and the occasional tangent that turned out to be relevant in ways neither of them had anticipated. She learned things about the 13th century that no textbook contained. He learned, she suspected, that she was not going to dissolve under the weight of knowing what he was. What she had not expected was that he was funny. Not obviously, not in the way of someone who performed humor for effect, but occasionally, when she said something that accidentally illuminated the particular absurdity of a situation, he would say something dry and precise in response, and she would realize only a second or two later that it had been a joke, and she would laugh, and he would look at her with an expression she had begun to privately categorize as startled interest. She had also not expected that he would be curious about her. Not about her professional credentials, about her. He asked about her research, not the Vale project, but her own work, the things she pursued when no one was paying her to pursue them. He asked about the thesis that only 40 people had read. He asked what she had wanted to study before she ended up specializing in what she specialized in. He asked the way people ask when they are genuinely interested in the answer, rather than simply filling the silence while waiting for their turn to speak. No one had asked Coraline questions like that in quite some time. She answered them honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer anything, and she noticed that he listened to her answers with the same complete attention he gave to historical documents, which was more than most people gave to things that were currently happening in front of them. She did not think about this too much, or rather, she told herself she was not thinking about it too much, and mostly succeeded. The complication arrived on a Thursday in the form of a woman named Isabeau, who appeared at the archive door at 11 in the morning, with cheekbones like architectural decisions and a coat that suggested the kind of wealth that doesn't need to advertise itself. Coraline was elbow-deep in a collection of 17th century estate correspondence, and did not immediately notice the way the temperature in the room shifted when Isabeau entered it, or the way Dorian became very still in a different way than his usual stillness, a reactive stillness, rather than arresting one. Isabeau said his name. Not Dorian. A different name, older, the kind of name that sounded like it had been worn smooth by centuries of use. He said her name in return. Isabeau, measured and careful. Coraline looked up. The two of them were conducting an entire conversation in the space between words, in the compressed language of people who share a very long history and have learned to say difficult things without using their mouths. Coraline was good at reading things that didn't want to be read, and what she read in this particular exchange was complicated enough that she put down her document and gave it her full attention. Isabeau looked at her eventually. The look was not hostile. It was something more interesting than hostile. It was assessing, the way someone assesses a thing they were not expecting to find and are not yet sure what to do with. She said to Dorian, in a tone that was almost careful, "You didn't mention a researcher." He said, "I mentioned a specialist." Isabeau looked at Coraline again. Something moved across her face. Coraline could not name it precisely, but it belonged to the same category as the expression Dorian had worn when she had failed to be frightened of him on the second afternoon. It was the expression of someone encountering something that did not fit the pattern they had been using to navigate a situation. Isabeau stayed for 40 minutes, during which she and Dorian spoke quietly near the window about something Coraline made no effort to overhear, because she was a person with principles about that kind of thing. When Isabeau left, she paused at the door and looked back at Coraline one more time, with that same unclassifiable expression. Then, she was gone. Dorian returned to the table. He sat down. He picked up the document he had been examining before Isabeau arrived and looked at it for a moment without appearing to see it. Coraline said, "You don't have to explain anything." He said, "She is someone I have known for a long time. We have a complicated history." Coraline said, "Most histories are complicated when they're long enough." He looked at her over the top of the document. That fractional shift again. There and gone. He said, "Yes, I suppose that's true." They went back to work. But the air in the room had changed in some small, specific way that Coraline noted and filed and did not yet know what to do with. The night she saw him feed, she had not meant to be there at all. It was an accident of timing. The particular bad luck of having left her glasses on the archive table at 9:30 in the evening, and needing them to finish the translation she was working on at home. She had her spare pair, but the spare pair gave her headaches after 40 minutes and she had at least 3 hours of work left. So, she had gone back. The archive was dark except for the light in the back corridor. She had her key. She let herself in quietly, the way you do when you're entering a space that belongs to the nighttime hours and you're aware you're trespassing slightly on its nature. She found her glasses on the table where she had left them. She heard something in the corridor. She was not brave. Particularly, she was not the kind of person who investigated sounds in dark buildings with any enthusiasm. But the sound was not frightening exactly. It was just present. And she had made the mistake of pausing long enough for curiosity to get in ahead of self-preservation. She looked around the edge of the doorframe. Dorian was there, and with him was a man she had never seen before, who looked like he had not slept in several days and was on the far side of some kind of crisis. Dorian's hand was at the man's wrist. Not violently, almost gently. The man's face held an expression that was not pain, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone experiencing something very intense at the border between one state and another. Coraline stood very still. After a moment, Dorian released the man's wrist. He said something to him quietly. The man nodded, rolled down his sleeve, and left through the back door with the careful movements of someone recalibrating their balance. Dorian turned around. He saw her immediately. Of course he did. They looked at each other across the dark room. Coraline said, "He came to you." Dorian said, "He comes regularly. It is an arrangement." She said, "He's not frightened of you." He said, "No." She considered this for a moment. The man's face, the gentleness of Dorian's hand at his wrist, the careful way the man had left, not fleeing, just leaving. She said, Does it hurt them? He seemed slightly surprised by the question. Not the question itself, but its direction. The fact that it had gone immediately to the other person's experience, rather than to the logistics, or the morality, or the sheer strangeness of what she had just witnessed. He said, I try to ensure it doesn't. Most of them say it doesn't. I have been told the experience is not unpleasant. She said, most of them? He said, I am very old. I have learned to be careful. She picked up her glasses from the table and put them in her pocket. Then she stood there for a moment in the dark room with this ancient, impossible creature who was watching her with the same careful attention he always gave her, waiting to see what she would do with the thing she had just seen. She said, I'm going to go home and finish this translation. He said, all right. She said, I'll see you Thursday. He said, yes. She left. She walked home through the cold night air with her glasses in her pocket, and her mind running through everything she had observed with the methodical thoroughness she applied to things that mattered. By the time she reached her front door, she had arrived at several conclusions. He was not careless with the people around him. He had been doing this for centuries, and he had learned, as he said, to be careful. The man who had left had not been harmed. He had come willingly and left steadily, and the transaction between them had held a quality of mutual agreement that was more dignified than a lot of human interactions she had witnessed. She was still not afraid of him. This was, she recognized, somewhat unusual. She had a working theory about why, which was that fear was mostly a response to unpredictability, and Dorian Vale was one of the most consistently predictable people she had ever encountered. He did what he said. He was where he said he would be. He told her true things. He did not hide the difficult parts of what he was. He simply waited for her to encounter them in her own time, and then answered her questions honestly when she asked. She found this, on reflection, more trustworthy than most people she had known. She made tea. She sat at her desk. She opened her translation and worked until 2 a.m, and she did not dream about dark corridors or cold hands at wrists, but she did dream. Briefly and inconclusively, about dark eyes watching her across a room, with an expression she was only beginning to know how to name. The thing nobody tells you about spending significant amounts of time with a 700-year-old vampire is that the strangest part is not the supernatural elements. The strangest part is the ordinary ones. Dorian had opinions about tea, specific developed opinions that he had been refining for several centuries, and was not shy about expressing when the subject arose. He thought the archive's electric kettle was inadequate. He had views on steeping time. He had encountered the original Dutch traders who brought the first significant quantities of tea to Europe, and considered the subsequent centuries of British enthusiasm for the beverage to be one of history's more defensible developments. Coraline found this extremely funny. She was not sure why. Something about the image of this ancient, formerly terrifying creature having passionate feelings about a beverage. She had laughed the first time he said something particularly specific about water temperature, and he had gone very still in the way he did when something surprised him, and then he had said, carefully, as though testing the weight of it, "You find this amusing?" She said, "A little." "Yes. Is that all right?" He said, "No one has laughed at something I've said in quite some time." She said, "How long?" He thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to all her questions and said, "Longer than I can easily calculate." She said, "That's genuinely sad." He said, "I had stopped noticing." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, about what it would mean to stop noticing the absence of something. To have a gap in your life go on long enough that it became the landscape rather than a wound in it. It seemed like one of the lonelier things she had ever heard, stated so plainly by someone who clearly had not intended to sound lonely at all. She started making him tea more often. This was not a dramatic gesture. She did not announce it or make it meaningful out loud. She just started making 2 cups when she made one, and putting his on the table near his work, and he started accepting it with a particular quiet that meant something was being received without being acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it directly would make it into a larger thing than either of them was ready for it to be yet. Isabeau came back twice more in the following weeks. The second time, she stayed longer, and Coraline overheard enough of the conversation near the window to understand that there was some kind of governance structure in Dorian's world. Something with rules and territories and obligations that did not pause, simply because he had decided to spend his time in a small archive with a document specialist who made him tea and laughed at his opinions about it. Isabeau seemed to represent some part of that structure. She was not an enemy, but she was a complication. The third time Isabeau came, she sat down across from Coraline while Dorian was occupied with something in the back room and looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "He hasn't brought a human into his work before. Not like this." Coraline said, "I'm here professionally." Isabeau said, "Yes, that's what's interesting. She said it the way you say something when you mean it carries more weight than its face value suggests." Coraline filed it. She said to Isabeau, "Is there something I should know?" Isabeau seemed to consider this with genuine seriousness. She said, "He is not a person who does things accidentally. When he makes a choice, it has usually been a long time in the making." Coraline said, "What choice are we talking about?" Isabeau looked at her. Something in her expression shifted from assessing to something that was almost improbably fond, she said. "When you figure that out, it will make sense of quite a few things." Then, Dorian came back, and Isabeau stood, and the conversation closed itself off with the finality of a door. But Coraline sat with it for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to documents that seemed to be about one thing, but were actually about another. That evening, walking home, she thought about choices that had been a long time in the making. She thought about a man who had stopped noticing the absence of laughter. She thought about the way he watched her think, and the questions he asked about her work, and the particular quality of the silence between them which had long since stopped being the silence of strangers and become something else entirely. She thought. Oh, then she walked faster and did not think about it for the rest of the evening, because she was not ready yet, and she knew herself well enough to know when she needed more time. She was cataloging a collection of 18th century correspondence when he said it. There was no preamble. There was no particular reason for that specific afternoon to be different from the ones before it, except that the light through the archive windows was doing something particular with the dust in the air, and she had just said something about a letter she was reading. Something about how the writer had clearly been in love with the person they were writing to, but had spent the entire letter talking around it in the most elaborate possible way, never once saying the thing directly. She had said, "Imagine spending that much energy not saying something." And he had said, "I would like you to be my wife." Coraline put down the letter. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the expression she had finally, 2 weeks ago, succeeded in naming. The one she had been filing under startled interest, and then under something warmer and more specific than that. He looked like someone who had made a decision after a very long time of making it, and had just stepped off a ledge he had been standing at the edge of for longer than she could calculate. She said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "I am aware of the context. I am aware that we have known each other for 8 weeks, and that by any conventional measure this is not a reasonable thing to say. I am also aware that I am not a conventional person, and that you are not, in my experience, a person who responds well to things being obscured for the sake of convention." He paused. "I would like you to be my wife. I have wanted to say this for approximately 6 weeks, and I have been trying to identify the correct moment, which I have now decided does not exist. So I am saying it in this one instead." Coraline stared at him. Then, without any intention of doing so, she laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh that arrives when something has short-circuited the usual pathways between stimulus and response, when the situation is so far outside the expected range of experience that the body decides laughter is the only available exit. It came out of her completely involuntarily, honest and warm and helpless, and it filled the archive room with a sound that had not been in that room before. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately after, because she saw his face. He had gone very still. Not his usual stillness. A different kind. More fragile. The kind that belongs to something that has just been struck unexpectedly and is in the process of determining the extent of the damage. She said, through her hand, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm not that wasn't." She stopped. She took a breath. She lowered her hand. She said, "That was not a no." He looked at her. She said, "I laughed because I was not expecting it, and my brain made an error. I am not laughing at you. Or at what you said." She paused. "I realize that distinction may not be particularly helpful right now, but I want to be accurate." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "You laughed." She said, "Yes," he said, slowly, as though examining the experience from multiple angles simultaneously. "No one has laughed in a moment I considered significant in a very long time." She said, "How long?" He thought about it. 700 years, approximately, give or take a decade. She said, 700 years since someone laughed at something you said in a serious moment? He said, 700 years since I said something serious enough to laugh at. There was a pause in which Coraline processed this, and Dorian appeared to be processing something of his own. Then he said, and his voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, a quality she could only describe as tentative. It was not an unpleasant sound. She looked at him very carefully. She said, "What did it sound like?" He said, after a moment, like something returning that I had forgotten was gone. Coraline sat with that sentence for a moment. The afternoon light moved through the dust. Somewhere outside, a car door closed and someone called out to someone else, and the ordinary world went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something was happening in a small archive room that was going to change the shape of at least 2 lives considerably. She said, "I need you to understand something." He said, "Yes," she said, "I am not going to give you an answer today. Not because the answer is no, but because I am a person who needs to process things at a reasonable speed, and what you have just said is not something I can process at a reasonable speed in the next 5 minutes. I need to go home and think about it properly." He said, "I understand." She said, "I will see you Thursday." He said, "Yes." She gathered her things with considerably less composure than usual, and left the archive with the specific sensation of someone who has just looked over the edge of something very high and discovered that it is not, in fact, terrifying, but is instead something else entirely. Something that has no clean name yet, but is going to require one. She did not wait until Thursday. She lasted until Tuesday evening, which she considered a reasonable demonstration of her capacity for patience under unusual circumstances. She sent him a message, which still struck her as faintly absurd, texting a 700-year-old vampire, and asked if he would meet her at the archive the following morning. He replied within 3 minutes, which told her something. She was not yet sure exactly what, but something. She arrived at 8. He was already there, which told her something more. She had spent 2 days thinking with the focused attention she usually reserved for research problems, which is to say she had approached the question from multiple angles, examined her own reactions, followed the threads of evidence backward to their sources, and arrived at a set of conclusions that felt solid in the way that only honest conclusions did. She sat down across from him and said, "I'm going to tell you what I've figured out, and then you can respond." He said, "All right." She said, "You chose me specifically for this project, not because I was the most prominent specialist available, because I wasn't, but because you had looked into my work and determined something about me that made you think I was suitable for what you actually needed, which was not a researcher, but a person who could know what you are and not break under the weight of it." He said nothing, which was confirmation. She said, "You have been very careful. You didn't tell me what you were until I forced the question. You let me encounter things at my own speed. You watched how I responded to each new thing before you moved to the next one. You were testing. Not in a manipulative way, but in the way of someone who has been hurt by people who couldn't handle the reality of them, and has learned to be cautious. He said, quietly, "Yes," she said. "Isabeau told me that you don't do things accidentally. I think you have been thinking about this, about whatever this is, for longer than 8 weeks." He said, "Considerably longer." She said, "How much longer?" He said, "I first encountered your work 4 years ago. A paper you published on contested medieval land claims. It was an excellent paper. You had found something in a set of documents that 3 previous researchers had missed, not because you were smarter than them, which you may or may not be, but because you were more patient. You were willing to sit with uncertainty for longer than was comfortable, and follow evidence rather than assumption." He paused. "I found this quality rare. I began to watch your career. When the project required a specialist, I requested you specifically. Coraline absorbed this. She said, 4 years. He said, yes. She said, you spent 4 years deciding whether to meet me. He said, I spent 4 years determining whether it was fair to bring you into the complicated reality of what I am, whether you were someone who would be harmed by it, or someone who could carry it. I was not certain until quite recently." She said, "What made you certain?" He said, "The night you saw me in the corridor. You went home. You came back on Thursday. You asked me whether it hurt them." He looked at her steadily. "You were not afraid, and you were not fascinated in the way that becomes dangerous. You were simply trying to understand something accurately. I have not met many people who respond to the difficult parts of the world that way." Coraline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I've been falling in love with you for about 5 weeks, and I've been refusing to think about it clearly until now." The room was very still. He said, "And now that you're thinking about it clearly?" She said, "It doesn't frighten me." Which is interesting, because it probably should. He said, "It probably should." She said, "Is the proposal still open?" He looked at her. The shift in his face was not fractional this time. It was visible, a real change, something moving in his expression that was too large and too long held to contain itself in the small, careful adjustments she was used to reading from him. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely unguarded. He said, "It has been open for longer than 8 weeks." She said, "I'm going to need more time before I give you a proper answer. But I wanted you to know the direction I'm moving in." He said, "The direction is sufficient." She said, "Good." And then, because she was who she was, she pulled out her notebook and said, "Now, can we talk about the Valerius estate records from the 15th century? Because I found something yesterday that I think you're going to find interesting." He looked at her for one more moment, with an expression she now had a name for. Then, he said, "Yes, show me." She told her friend Priya about it on a Wednesday night over noodles, in the way you tell a person something when you have been not telling them for long enough that it has become a pressure you need to release. Priya listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which was extraordinary, because Priya interrupted most things. She sat with her chopsticks suspended over her bowl and listened to the full account, from the first appointment to the corridor to Isabeau to the proposal to the Tuesday morning conversation, and when Coraline finished, she said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "Show me a photo." Coraline said, "There's barely any photographic record of him." Priya said, "Coraline." Coraline showed her the photograph from the charity function, the one the forum users had found unsettling. Priya looked at it for a long time. She said, "Okay, I understand the problem." Coraline said, "There isn't a problem." Priya said, "The problem is that he's clearly completely in love with you, and has been since before you met, and you've just told me about it in the tone of voice you use when you've already made a decision, and you're retrospectively explaining your reasoning." Coraline said, "That's not," Priya said. "Coraline, you made him tea." There was a pause. Coraline said, "People make tea." Priya said, "You don't make people tea. You make yourself tea, and you exist in proximity to other people while drinking it. You have never in the 11 years I have known you made another person tea unless you were actively worried about them or actively in love with them. Coraline was quiet. Priya said, "Which one was it?" Coraline said, "After a moment, both. Probably. In that order." Priya looked at her for a moment and then said, "What are you afraid of?" Coraline said, "I'm not afraid." Priya said, "Then what are you waiting for?" This was the question Coraline carried home with her, through the cold streets and up the stairs to her flat, where she made tea out of habit and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about it honestly. What was she waiting for? Not for him to prove himself further, he had done that. Not for the situation to become less complicated, it was not going to become less complicated. Not for certainty, because certainty was not available in this or most situations, and she knew better than to require it before moving. She realized, waiting for herself, waiting for the last of the careful, protective structures she had built around her own interior life, to determine whether this was something she was willing to let past them. She sat with this for a long time. The structures had been built for reasons. She had learned, at various points in her life, that caring about things made you vulnerable to their loss, and she had become quietly expert at managing the level of her investment in anything. It was not cynicism, it was a kind of careful self-governance that had served her reasonably well for a long time. But she thought about what Dorian had said about stopping noticing an absence, about a gap that had been present so long it became landscape, and she recognized, sitting in her kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, that she had her own version of that. Her own things she had stopped noticing were missing. She did not want to become someone who stopped noticing. She picked up her phone. She sent him a message. It said, "I've decided." He replied, within 3 minutes again, "Tell me tomorrow." It should be said out loud. She put her phone down. She finished her tea. She went to bed and slept better than she had in several weeks, which told her something she had probably already known. She arrived at the archive the next morning at 8 and found him already there, standing by the window with a cup of tea prepared for her on the table. She said, "Yes." He turned from the window. She said, "To be precise about it, yes, I will marry you, with the understanding that we are going to need to talk at considerable length about the practical implications of what that means, and I am going to need you to answer all of my questions honestly, including the difficult ones, because that is how I am, and it is not going to change." He said, "I know," she said, "and I laughed at your proposal." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to know that I've thought about it since, and I think it's actually fine. I think if you had asked me in a dramatic way, with appropriate staging and solemnity, I would have found it harder. The fact that it came out in the middle of a working afternoon because you got tired of not saying it is," she paused, searching for the word "it's very you," actually, which is to say, I think it was exactly right, even though it wasn't what either of us expected. He looked at her for a long moment, that visible, unguarded expression again. He said, "The laugh." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I have been thinking about it since you left on Monday. I played it back several times. The sound of it." He paused. I was not certain, initially, how to understand what I felt when I heard it, but I have concluded that it is the most honest response I have ever received to anything I have said in 700 years. Coraline said, "That's a good way of looking at it." He said, "I am not done." She said, "Sorry. Go ahead." He said, "I have given proposals before, twice, in other centuries, in the contexts of political alliance and social necessity. They were received with appropriate gravity and appropriate acceptance. I have spent a great deal of time, more than I realized until recently, in rooms where the weight of what I am requires people to perform a particular kind of seriousness in my presence, to treat me as something that requires careful handling." He looked at her steadily. "You have never once done that." She said, "You don't require careful handling." He said, "Most people believe I do." She said, Most people haven't spent 40 hours cataloging historical documents with you. Something in his face shifted again, and this time she recognized it immediately, because she had been cataloging his expressions for weeks, with the same patient attention she gave to everything that mattered. It was the expression she had started to think of as the one she was the only person currently alive who had seen. The one that came when she said something that landed in the part of him that had been unreachable for a very long time. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He said, "Always." She said, "When I laughed, before you decided it was all right. In that first moment, what did it feel like?" He was quiet for a few seconds. She watched him decide to tell her the truth, rather than the safer version of it. He said, "Like the part of me that had been waiting in the cold for a very long time, had just heard something that meant the cold might eventually end." The archive was very quiet around them. Outside, the town was waking up, going about its business, completely unaware. She took his hand. His fingers were cold, as always, and closed around hers with a careful, deliberate pressure, as though he was aware of his own strength and had long practice at moderating it. She said, "For the record, the answer has been yes for longer than Tuesday." He said, "How much longer?" She said, "About 5 weeks. I was just processing at a reasonable speed." He made a sound then, low, quiet, surprised out of him. She realized after a moment that it was a laugh, the smallest possible version of one, but real and completely involuntary. She looked up at him. He looked faintly astonished at himself. He said, "I don't believe I've done that in quite some time either." She said, "How long?" He said, 700 years. Give or take. She said, "We're going to fix that." The practical implications turned out to be numerous, which surprised neither of them. They spent the better part of 3 weeks talking through them at the archive table with the same methodical approach they had applied to the documents, identifying complications, examining options, arriving at workable conclusions. Coraline had a notebook specifically for this purpose. She was aware that this was possibly an unusual way to approach an engagement, but Dorian had not once suggested that she approach it any other way, and she suspected he found her thoroughness more reassuring than alarming. The question of her mortality was the most significant one. He did not raise it first. She did, on a Tuesday morning with her tea half finished, stating it plainly because that was the only way she knew how to handle large things. She said, "I'm going to die considerably before you." He said, "Yes," she said. "There are options." He said, "Yes," she said. "I need you to tell me about all of them, including the ones you think I won't want, because I want to make this decision with accurate information." He told her about all of them, including the difficult ones. He told her with the same directness he had always used with her, not minimizing the costs and not overstating the benefits, laying out each option with its full weight intact and letting her work through it without trying to guide her toward any particular conclusion. She asked questions for 2 hours. He answered them all. At the end of it, she said, "I need some time with this one." He said, "Take as long as you need." She said, "I may need to talk to Priya." He said, "That seems reasonable." She said, "She's going to want to meet you." Something crossed his face. Not fear exactly, but a close relative of it. She said, "She's not going to be frightened of you. She's going to ask you highly personal questions and make observations about your emotional state that are more accurate than is comfortable." He said, "I see." She said, "She'll probably like you, eventually. She likes people who are honest." He said, "I will endeavor to be honest." She said, "You don't know how to be anything else. That's going to work in your favor." Priya met him for dinner 2 weeks later at the kind of restaurant with paper tablecloths that Coraline liked, because she could draw diagrams on them when she was thinking. Priya arrived 5 minutes late, sat down, looked at Dorian for approximately 10 seconds, and then said, "You've been in love with her since before you met her." Dorian said, "Yes," Priya said, "and you spent 4 years deciding whether to introduce yourself." He said, Yes, Priya looked at Coraline. She said, "He's worse than you." Coraline said, "I know. It's actually quite compatible." Priya turned back to Dorian and said, "If you hurt her, I will not be able to do anything about it because you are apparently immortal and supernaturally powerful. But I want you to know I will be extremely disappointed." He said, "That would be sufficient motivation." Priya studied him for another moment. Then, she said, "Coraline told me you laughed last month." He said, "Yes," she said. "She said it surprised you." He said, "It had been some time." Priya looked at Coraline again with an expression that communicated an entire paragraph of friendship efficiently. Then she picked up the menu and said, "All right. Tell me about the 13th century. What was the food situation? Because I have theories." Coraline watched him process this question, the shift from personal interrogation to genuine intellectual curiosity, and watched him recalibrate and then actually answer the question with the detail of a primary source, and watched Priya lean forward with her elbows on the paper tablecloth, because she was always interested in a primary source. She thought, this is going to be all right. Not in the vague way of hoping something might work out. In the specific way of having looked at the available evidence, followed the threads, and arrived at a conclusion that felt solid. They married in November, in the small garden of the Whitmore estate, with Priya as witness and Isabeau standing at the back with an expression that had finally resolved itself, after weeks of careful observation, into something that looked very much like approval. It was not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted a large ceremony. Coraline wore a dress the color of winter fog, which she had found in a second-hand shop, and altered herself, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers, because she preferred them to fresh ones, which always seemed slightly anxious about their own brevity. The registrar was a human man who had worked with Dorian for some years on various administrative complications that arose from an immortal person needing to maintain a functional legal existence across centuries, and who had clearly long since made his own peace with the unusual nature of his client. When it was done, when the papers were signed, and the registrar had offered his congratulations with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had just witnessed something he would be processing for some time, Priya opened a bottle of champagne she had brought in her bag, because she was Priya, and they stood in the cold November garden and drank it. Isabeau took a glass, which Coraline had not expected. She said to Coraline quietly, while Dorian and Priya were engaged in what appeared to be a spirited disagreement about something, "I want to tell you something." Coraline said, "All right." Isabeau said, "I have known Dorian for 400 years. I have watched him become very good at surviving, at enduring, at continuing." She paused. I had forgotten that those things are not the same as living. Coraline said, "What changed?" Isabeau looked at her steadily. She said, "You laughed at him." Coraline said, "He told you about that?" Isabeau said, "He didn't tell me. I could see it in him the next time I came to the archive. Something had shifted. He was different in a way I hadn't seen in a very long time." She paused again. He had been struck by something real. He looked like someone who had just been reminded that the world contained things that could still surprise him. Coraline looked across the garden at Dorian, who was currently making a point to Priya with the precise, slightly formal manner he used when he was also, underneath it, enjoying himself. Priya was gesturing at him with her champagne glass. He looked, she realized, like someone who was in the middle of an ordinary moment and finding it, specifically, good. She said to Isabeau, "He told me he hadn't laughed in 700 years." Isabeau said, "He hadn't. Not like that. Not without purpose." She looked at Coraline with the expression that had taken weeks to classify, but which Coraline now recognized clearly as a kind of long-held protectiveness finally releasing its guard. That laugh of yours was the first spontaneous, unguarded thing that had happened to him in a very long time. He didn't know what to do with it. That's why it meant so much. Coraline thought about this. She said, "He said it sounded like something returning that he'd forgotten was gone." Isabeau said, "Yes, that sounds right." Across the garden, Dorian turned his head and found her, the way he always did, with the unerring directness of something oriented to a fixed point. He looked at her across the cold November air with the unguarded expression she now knew so well, the one that had taken her weeks to name, and that she now thought of simply as him, the version of him that existed only in the specific privacy they had built between them. She raised her champagne glass slightly. He looked at her for a moment. Then, quiet and real and completely involuntary, he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was barely a smile at all. Technically, the smallest possible upward movement at the corner of his mouth, the kind of expression that required a person who had been paying close attention for long enough to recognize it for what it was. Priya, who was also paying close attention because she always was, said under her breath, "Oh, that's devastating." Coraline said, "I know." Priya said, "You're going to be fine." She was. They were. Not because everything was simple. It wasn't, and it wasn't going to be. But because they were both people who approached complicated things with patience and honesty and a willingness to follow evidence wherever it led. And what the evidence led to, in this case, was each other. The journey from that first appointment to this cold November garden with its champagne and its witnesses and its pile of signed paperwork was not the story of a woman who had been rescued or transformed into something she wasn't. It was the story of two people who had both, in their different ways, gotten very good at being alone, discovering that the skill they had each developed for surviving solitude was not as necessary as they had believed. She had not needed saving. She had needed to be accurately seen, which is different, and harder, and rarer. He had not needed to be fixed or softened or brought into the light. He had needed someone who could sit with him in the dark and find it sufficient, which she could, which she did. Some things do not announce themselves. They arrive in the middle of an ordinary working afternoon, in mismatched socks, with ink on your cheek, and they sit across a table from you and wait, with the patience of something very old, for you to be ready to see them clearly. And when you finally laugh, unexpected and honest and helpless, at the most serious moment either of you has yet shared, it is not an interruption of the story. It is the beginning of it.